Hello, everybody. This is an introduction to social-cultural anthropology, and the topic of the week is tradition and modernity. I think it's a very important topic for social-cultural anthropology, and it's very important in our context, in particular, in which the concepts of tradition and modernity have been opposed to each other for so long. This construction of opposition between tradition and modernity, it started, I would say, with the Soviet modernization project. And from that time, tradition in particular has been problematized and conceptualized as something irrational, as something primordial, as something that people do without reflection and without choice. And in this class, in anthropology in general, we're going to part with this tradition, and we're not going to refer to tradition in this way. So from the anthropological perspective, tradition is not something primordial. Яғни дәстүр деген ол байырғы мыңжылдық дәстүр емес. Традиция не что-то такое исконно посконное, что там пришло к нам без изменений, там ата заманнан, баба заманнан, с тех пор, которые мы даже не помним, и которые мы продолжаем как бы без рефлексии и без собственного выбора. So, tradition is not something primordial that has continued forever from the times immemorial and reached to us without change. On the contrary, tradition is always an adaptation to a concrete historical environment. Традиция – это адаптация к конкретным историческим условиям. For instance, a Kazakh wedding 100 years ago and today is not the same, even if we imagine that we are continuing this tradition of Kazakh weddings. People are not throwing weddings because their ancestors organized weddings 100 years ago. They're doing it today because of the pressures of today. For one thing, I would say that a wedding 100 years ago might have been a much simpler affair than a wedding today. The same way we talk about modernity, we don't think that modernity is always something great, something we have, something that has always been good and has to be aspired to. If you watched the film about Mongolian Kazakhs that I posted on Moodle, you see how in the film we talk about Kazakhs heating the stove with manure, right? And that's something that we would think even 50 years ago, we would think as something not modern, right? Because, coal is modern, gas is modern, heating one stove with manure is not modern. But today, with our new eco-thinking coming into the frame and so on the contrary, we think that it's cool and manure is a renewable fuel. Manure is tizek. Tizek taitovatarman. And this is very cool that Kazakhs in Mongolia are using this renewable fuel to heat their stoves. And on the contrary, if previously we thought of the coal as something, we have to go out and discover coal and use coal to power, our coal stations that up to this day heat our cities and so on. Today, people problematize coal because coal is a source of pollution in our cities. And if you drive from Kosher or the places where they heat get their heating from coal, it's very evident, right? That coal, and as a polluting fuel, it's not so modern as it is used to be. So what I'm trying to say is that when we adopt something as modern, we have to think of it, to what extent it's going to be useful, and to what extent it's really just a shiny something that appeals to us today as something modern, but might not be. And one example that I can give you that I saw in my lifetime is plastic bags. When I was growing up in the late Soviet Union, we didn't have plastic bags, and plastic bag was something of, of the representation of the Western world, representation of something modern, and so on. And when I was a child, that's how he came with a beautiful plastic bag, and there are so many, like it's something shiny, something nice. But today, that's not how we treat plastic bags, right? Plastic bags is a source of, pollution, and plastic overall is a source of pollution. So that's my example of how we have to think critically about what is being like pushed on us as modern. And also we have to think of tradition as not something primordial and outdated, but something that people do today. And if people do it today, it means that it's an adaptation to today's life, rather. And they do it like they make their own choice to organize a wedding, to do something else that's considered, quote unquote, traditional. And in this, when talking about tradition, I also want to mention something that's happening in our country, and this is a state-initiated program called Ruhani Жаңғыру. And one of the tenets of this program is called modernization based on tradition. So actually, I think that the people who worked on this program did their homework in classical sociology and contemporary anthropology of thinking through about what is tradition and why we should stop opposing modernity to tradition. Those of you who are sociologists, who want to be sociologists, and I encourage, and those of you who want to be anthropologists, and I also encourage that, are going to read in your sociology classes Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And Weber, in this book, he convincingly argues that the emergence of Western modernity and capitalism is closely connected with the emergence of a certain stratum of the bourgeoisie who had a particular religious upbringing and religious values called like the Protestant values. So their way of relating to God and their way of trying to be a godly person created these work ethics, which we call Protestant ethics, right? An investment culture that then gave rise to the accumulation of capital and its productive uses. So one could say that the capitalism today and modernity, Western modernity, is based on, as Weber argues, is based on this Protestant tradition. At the same time, with the global spread of capitalism, it does not mean that we all have become Protestants, right? Anthropologists would argue that today we have many different kinds of modernity. Chinese and Korean modernity that is based on Confucian values. Japanese modernity based on strict hierarchical corporations, ideas of service and loyalty. Emirati modernity based on Muslim cosmopolitanism of a trading nation. Can one have 4 wives and be modern? Not just modern, but hypermodern, supermodern, as many Emiratis are. And the answer is yes, one could uphold his own tradition and be modern at the same time. So it's very important when constructing, as this sort of alternative modernities show, it's very important when constructing or imagining modernity to imagine it's to be based on tradition rather than go against tradition. And the modernity that is not based on tradition and cultural roots is not going to be sustainable and going to fade away without leaving much trace. Or perhaps it will leave some traces. We can see the traces of this modernity in abandoned military towns, mining towns, and so on, the traces of Soviet industrialization. And coal that we use today, and which we no longer consider modern, is also a trace of the Soviet imprint of the Soviet modernization. And also, if you watched this film on Mongolia, on Kazakhs from Mongolia, I think I'm telling there that after even though like the Soviet modernity has been opposed to non-European tradition of non-European people of the Soviet Union, and it was important to get away with this tradition, non-European tradition, or particularly the tradition of nomadism, of seasonal migration, and so on. But there is this deep-seated nostalgia, like for instance among Kazakhs, even though we no longer live according to that tradition, there is this deep-seated nostalgia, and I would say there is even a revival of tradition, and it's not just a revival of tradition in terms of the weddings and like family life and all of this Kazakh things that we now aspire to and want to have, but it's also in terms of the way of life, way of farming. For instance, I know that the horse herding has been growing. Now the population of horses in Kazakhstan has reached 3 million. We are ahead of Russia. We're still behind Mongolia and behind like America, Australia, Brasilia, and 6 countries that have a larger population of horses. But the population of horses is growing because this is a sort of a way of life, a tradition, horse herding, and you know the horse herding is happening in between these sort of wild, like in semi-wild conditions when people just put them to like herd themselves, and the stallion of the herd is looking after the herd, like 15 or 20 mares with foals, and it has been growing after the collapse of the Soviet Union, particularly because it's something that makes sense for the people in the countryside. There's something that's well adapted to the climatic conditions of Kazakhstan, because the horses can graze. You don't have to put much labor and much food to them. They can find their own food by grazing throughout winter as well. So that's what I call sort of a cultural adaptation. That's why like the horse herding has been widely spread on the territory of Kazakhstan, and that's why it's spreading today as well. So this is, I hope you'll take it from this class that's how we think of tradition. Tradition is an adaptation to concrete historical situation, and tradition is dynamic. So дәстүр ол қатып қалған бірдеңе емес, ол жаңағы өзгереді, ол бейімделеді өмірге қарай, заманға қарай бейімделеді. Also for today, for this week, we are reading Aksana Ismailbekova's piece, Constructing Women's Authority, Constructing Authority Through Tradition in the village of Bulak. And I think this is one of the pieces that shows how tradition works in women's life, and how they can use tradition to grow their power and to grow their authority and to have a certain, what she calls, a family career. And in this piece, she goes, for this article, she went to a Kyrgyz village, and she gives us the stories of 4 women. And she shows how the status for women of different ages, and she shows us how the status of this woman is changing based on their age, based on the time they have been married, the number of children they have, and their relationship with the in-laws. So, for instance, the first woman she talks about is Nurguz. She's in her 30s. The second woman, I think, in her 50s. And there is a woman two women in their 70s. And if the first woman, who is in her 30s, she tells her story that now her authority, now she's in the 30s, and she doesn't have all the authority that she wants, but she says that her authority has grown since the time that she was 20. When she was 20, when she was just a young Kylian who came to this family, she didn't have any authority. She had to serve everybody, like her life was hard. But then, with time, she said she became more authoritative, and she even could discipline her husband with the help of in-laws. Her husband wanted to have an affair on the side, and she with the help of her in-laws, she stopped this affair. So Aksana Ismailbekova shows how the family is not only the way to discipline women, but it also is a way to discipline men. Then she talks about women in their 40s and 50s and 70s who got this lots of authority, and the way and it's also like that this authority was not given to them. It's something that they built over time through maintaining relationship with their in-laws, through serving their in-laws and so on. But then they became very powerful, particularly the Chinarapai, who is the elder of the village and decides on many affairs of the village, when to conduct weddings, what to do for holidays, and so on and so forth. So I really like the way Aksana Ismailbekova shows woman's gender status not as fixed. In particular, okay, I have this gender as a female, and I'm always going to be, as a woman, I'm always going to be powerless and subservient to men, and so no, actually, this is not the case, at least in the Kyrgyz village that she's describing. So, and I think it could be compared to career in any other walks of life. So if this is a family career for a woman, right, that she starts with no authority, with no being subservient, that she has to, in order to gain authority, she has to serve. I think it could be compared with other careers, right? For instance, careers in academia, when you, start as a postdoc, or as an assistant professor, you do everything that other people tell you to do, and then you grow, right? And then with some hope you can grow to, at least in my walk of life, you can grow to a full professor and have lots of authority, because you went through all of these stages of the academic career. And that's something that of course cannot be taken for granted. It's not that if you started as an assistant professor, it does not necessarily guarantee that you end up as a full professor. And actually the same happens in the Kyrgyz village, when Aksana Ismailbekova talks about the story of Nazi Papa, I think, in her 70s, the woman who, despite being Kylian, being wife, and then being mother-in-law, she did not gain authority that supposedly women of her age should have, in her 70s. On the contrary, she lost the authority, and the reason she lost the authority was that she could not build relationship with her daughter-in-law. So I think it's great how Aksana Ismailbekova shows that it's not a given that if you are a certain age or a certain status, that you will automatically have this authority. No, everything is contingent upon your own personality, upon your own input into community. So this is Aksana Ismailbekova's contribution in a nutshell. You were also reading another article in Russian by Lora Olson and Светлана Адоньева, Советские, крестьянки, половозрастная идентичность, структура, история. And this is similar to Aksana Ismailbekova piece in the sense that it shows how women's status changes according to their age and marital status as well. But it also shows how it was broken during the Soviet time, so that if previously, and it talks more about both men and women, so women had to go through being like девка, then молодуха, then with лакту большуха, and then men would go through парень, then мужик, then большак, and then the Soviet collectivization project, it did away with большак, the sort of the patriarchal authority of a big patriarchal family, and it brought like tremendous changes to the structure of the family. Suddenly, the mother-in-law became the head of the family, and it put her into a conflict with the daughter-in-law, which previously was not the usual conflict, daughter-in-law and mother-in-law conflict, which is nowadays in the modern Russian village has become one of the main conflicts, family conflicts in the like this structurally. And in this article, Olson and Adonьева, they don't give us names, but they interview women of several generations, and they show how these different generations of women refer differently to tradition, and how tradition kind of changed, or like in the case of this particular region in Russia, rather faded, and how people relate to it. People of different ages relate to it. So save your questions for Q&A session on Friday, and we will discuss these two pieces. Bye.